So, chapter 12, as I mentioned last week, begins the description section of Romans. I mentioned that Romans is neatly divided into three sections. There's a diagnosis section where Paul says, we're all screwed up, and there's no hope for any of us, and we've all sinned and fallen short of God's glory. And then beginning in chapter 4 through chapter 11, Paul gives us the deliverance section where he shows in a variety of different and very powerful ways that Jesus has come to do for us what we could never do for ourselves. And then in chapter 12, he begins the description section. He's basically saying, in light of everything I have said up until now, this is what a free life, a life that has been set free, begins to look like. This is what it begins to feel like. And he spends the remaining chapters here popping off about what a life that has actually been set free is. And you can tell that he's doing that because he begins chapter 12 by saying, therefore, in other words, in light of everything I've said, let me describe for you what life begins to look like. Because everything I've said about you is true, this is what your life will begin to look like. And up until this point, Paul has been telling us what we are free from. Okay, so in chapters 1 through 11, Paul's been going on about what we are free from. Because of what Jesus fully accomplished for us, we are free from sin and death. We're free from the demand to measure up. We're free from the demand to get it all right. We're free from the obligation to fix ourselves and find ourselves and validate ourselves. And now he switches gears and tells us what we are free for. Freedom has two sides to it. There's freedom from, which is what he's been telling us for 11 chapters, and then beginning here, he begins describing what we are free for. And the reason this is so important to point out is because all of the exhortations that follow do not come in the form of you must. Rather, they come in the form of because you're free, you can. There's a huge difference between those two things. Because if we read these things as if they are obligations to maintain God's favor, we will get the vertical and horizontal planes that I talked about last week all confused. And we'll begin thinking that on the days when we are not loving our neighbor with brotherly affection, like it says here, when we're not blessing those who persecute us and feeding our enemy and all of those things that we all fail to do, we'll begin thinking that signals God's lack of love for us when we're not doing well. And so it's important to understand that everything that follows here takes the form of because you're free, you can. Not you must or God will cast you out. Okay, there's a big difference between those two things. And the free life, I mentioned last week that Paul describes in this section, is the life of self-forgetfulness. That's what he's describing here. In all of these, in the rest of the book, rest of this letter, what he's describing as the free life, and he gives a variety of different examples of it, is the life of self-forgetfulness. And we typically don't think of freedom as self-forgetfulness because we have naturally believed the lie that freedom happens when we indulge ourselves. Okay, and you can trace that all the way back to the Garden of Eden, the serpent's lie. You know, if you can just become independent, if you can just become like God, you will be free. If you can just detach yourself from God and His ways and His will, and you can become a God for yourself, you'll be free. Well, that initial lie takes a variety of different forms throughout our lives. You can see it in culture. We are constantly encouraged to indulge ourselves. And what's implied there is that if we indulge ourselves, if we can achieve for ourselves, if we can perform well, if we can do everything we think we need to do, then we will be happy and we will be free and we will be satisfied and we'll find everything that our hearts long for. We'll have fullness of life. And so it's very, very counterintuitive to think about freedom as self-forgetfulness rather than self-indulgence, but that's precisely what Paul describes here, because you and I both know by experience that the pursuit of our own happiness is burdensome. It makes life heavy. It doesn't make life light. You know that when you and I are consumed with what we think we need to get and achieve and do and become, believing that that will set us free, that doesn't make life lighter. It makes life heavier, because what happens in those moments is you begin really sensing and feeling that this whole thing is riding on my shoulders, and if I don't pull it off, I'm in trouble. And so we become addicted to our own self-salvation projects. But Paul shows that the free life is a life liberated from the need to get anything for yourself: validation, love, respect, meaning, and so on. That's what the free life is. It's a life free of burdens that we put on our own shoulders because we live life to get rather than give. And so the life he describes here is the life of grace. It's the opposite of the life of law, or life by law, which is legalism. And let me kind of tease this out for a second. The law focuses all of your attention on you. How am I doing? Am I making it? Am I succeeding in getting other people to notice me? Have I finally done enough to make him pay attention to me? Have I done enough to get respect from my peers? Okay, that's life by law. It's a life of self-consumption. You're consumed with yourself. You are burdening yourself by what you have to do and who you have to become. It's a conditional existence that operates according to the idea that I will get the love I crave if I can become lovely. I will get the acceptance I long for if I can become acceptable. And then we try to figure out on our own, what do we have to do in order to become lovely? What do we have to do in order to become acceptable? And Martin Luther taught that turning in was really the essence of the fall. The sin, the original sin in the Garden of Eden, that turning inward was the essence of the fall. And this is what he said: it is the devil that wants to always cast us back on our own resources. That's the devil's lie. He wants us to turn in on ourselves, believing that we possess everything we need in order to find freedom and fullness of life. We're always collapsing in on ourselves. The self, in other words, is this black hole that is endlessly sucking everything into itself and constantly contemplating its own case. And that's not a life of freedom. It's a life of slavery. And one serious consequence, and this is what Paul's getting at here, one serious consequence of a legalistic life is that we are so consumed with ourselves that we fail to identify the needs of those around us. We're so wrapped up in what we need and what we think we need to do, trying to figure out if we're doing enough, if we're doing it right. We're so narcissistic in that sense that we fail to see the needs of those around us and then meet those needs. And the biggest difference between the practical effect of the law and the practical effect of the gospel is that the law turns us inward and the gospel turns us outward. That's one of the huge, or the biggest practical on-the-ground effect distinguishing those two things. I mean, we were designed to love God and others. That's precisely the way Jesus summed up the whole law. When he was asked to sum up the law, the religious leaders were trying to trick him, and they were trying to prove that he was a false prophet. And so what they wanted him to do was to look at the law of Moses, the 10 Commandments, and say, okay, which one's most important? To sort of show that he was an anti-law guy. And instead of sort of pulling back, Jesus pushes forward and says, the summary of the entire law is to love the Lord your God with all of your heart, all of your soul, all of your mind, and all of your strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus never, ever backed off of the law's demands, ever. In fact, he pushed them deeper in by saying, keeping the law is not simply a matter of what you do on the outside, it's a matter of what's going on inside and how you actually feel about keeping the law and what's motivating you to keep the law. And once he presses it in that deep, all of us are guilty. Because some of us can look like on the outside that we're pulling it off, but when we begin to explore our sordid motives and we begin to explore what's going on inside, whether or not we are happily and joyfully doing what the law tells us to do, or if we're gritting our teeth and bearing it, whatever the case may be, we know when we look inside that we're not pulling it off. We are not doing, we are not being, we are not becoming everything that God has called us to do and be and become. And so Jesus sums up the whole law by saying, love God and love others. That's the fulfillment of the law. And we were designed to love God. We were designed to love others. We were not designed to be consumed with ourselves, but we are. We are. And so when Paul says in verse 2, for instance, do not be conformed to the pattern of this world, that's what he's talking about. Now let me tell you, I've heard so many sermons on Romans chapter 12, verses 1 to 2, and because everything up until Romans 12 is forgotten once we get to Romans 12, what ends up happening is a preacher or someone, a Sunday school teacher, will read these verses and say, okay, now let me give you a checklist of things you must avoid. What Paul's saying when he says, do not be conformed to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Don't read non-Christian books, read Christian books. Okay? Don't do bad things, do good things. You know, train your mind to think on good things. And what ends up happening, and while all of that stuff, not the Christian book thing, but while all of that stuff may be helpful, that's not what Paul's getting at here. In light of everything he has just said for 11 chapters, when he says, do not be conformed to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, he's issuing an invitation to live by grace rather than law. He's saying the real problem here, regardless of what you're doing on the outside, your behavior, the real problem here is that you're consumed with yourself. I mean, you're consumed with how you're doing, whether you're doing it right, whether you're pulling it off. You're consumed with what you think you need to get, what you think you need to do, what you think you need to extract from other people in order to be happy. You're constantly looking out for yourself. Those are the patterns of this world that he's saying, do not be conformed to, but rather be transformed by the renewing of your mind. In other words, allow God the Holy Spirit to continually preach, it is finished inside of you, so that the burden of having to get is lifted. It's life by grace. What he's doing here, the patterns of this world is life by law. It's all on you. It's all about you. Being transformed by the renewing of your mind is life by grace. It's all about Jesus. It's all about what he's done, which actually, as we'll see here in a minute, sets you free to give rather than get. You see, we live in a transactional world. You do so much for me and I'll do so much for you. You give a little and I'll give a little. But this conditionality, this sort of transactional reality that you and I live in, ruins the possibility of what matters most to God, which is love. And Paul says in verse 9, he begins by saying, let love be genuine. I mean, there are so many places in the Bible where God makes it very, very clear through the various writers that are actually penning the words. He makes it very, very clear that love is at the top. Faith, hope, and love, but the greatest of these is love. I mean, love is at the top. They will know you are my disciples by the way that you love one another. I mean, love is front and center of God's economy. We love him because he first loved us. And we could go on and on and on about how heavy the Bible is when it comes to its emphasis on love. And the bottom line is this conditionality of I'll do so much for you if you do so much for me. I'll give you a little if you give me a little. This ruins the possibility of love because conditionality is based on the premise that in order for me to be happy, I need you to do certain things and become a certain way. So this whole thing's about my happiness, my stability, my security. It's all about me finding and getting what I need. And in order for that to happen, I need to extract from you what I think I need in order to be stable and happy and fulfilled. And so life becomes relationships become all about, and this kills relationships, by the way, but relationships become all about, okay, I will give to you to the degree that you give to me. And therefore, relationships are just plagued by fear. Plagued by fear, because what happens if I lay myself on the line for you and I don't get a return? What happens if I invest in you and you don't invest in me? I mean, I'm left out in the cold. I'm left with no resources. I'm left without getting what I think I need in order to be happy. And that sort of thing absolutely ruins, plagues relationships. And we all know this to be true because all of our relationships are conditional. They're all conditional at some level. We will never experience unconditionality in an infallible way until Jesus comes back. Okay, so this isn't conditional relationships is not something that we're going to be able to just, lick and get out of our system while we remain in sin here. Okay, it's just not going to happen. But it's good to name the problem and recognize and identify the fact that this is what is at the root of our strained and tense relationships. This is what is at the root of our frustration. We are trying to save ourselves by extracting from other people what we think we need. And therefore, there is lots of give and take in relationships, and we don't want to give too much because we're afraid we might be taken. And we don't want to love too much because we're afraid we're not going to be loved back. And so we live life in self-protective mode, and therefore our relationships flounder, they shrink. That's the result, the fruit of conditionality. But the gospel of grace announces that everything we need, this is what Paul's been doing for 11 chapters, everything we need, everything we could possibly long for, in Christ we already possess. And this frees us, even in a fallible, fallen way, this frees us to relate to one another unconditionally, generously, and sacrificially, not perfectly. All of that stuff will be marred at some level by our sin and selfishness, but we can begin to get a taste for it, and we can begin to see new life being breathed into our frustrating relationships if we understand that everything, this is the grand, glorious announcement of the gospel, everything we need in Christ we already possess. And what that means is I can now do everything for you without needing you to do anything for me. So we can spend our lives giving without needing anything in return. Now you just think about that for a second and you go, oh, wouldn't that be amazing? If I could get that, would life not feel lighter? Would it not feel more free if I wasn't so worried about my needs and what I need to get and extract from you? Life would feel so much lighter, so much freer. And Paul says that the only thing that can enable us to experience that kind of freedom and unconditionality at some small snapshot level is the gospel of grace, which is why Paul says in verses 3 through 13 that you can be deferential. Look at what he says in verse 3. For by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned. And then he goes on to list different gifts that God gifts the church. He gifts the church people who possess certain gifts that are intended to be given, that are intended to be shared. And he says, this is, it's the gospel of grace. This idea that you don't need anything because you've been given everything, that actually sets you free to be deferential, that actually sets you free to celebrate the gifts and the successes of those around you, because now you don't need to fight for attention. You don't need to be on top. You don't need to be noticed. You don't need to win. That's slavery. Doesn't that feel like slavery? Just the thirst to be noticed, the thirst to win, the thirst to be on top. That doesn't make life lighter. That actually makes life feel heavy and burdensome. And so Paul says, you don't need to fight for attention. You don't need to be on top. You don't need to win. You don't need to be noticed. Because everything God has said about you is true based on what Jesus has accomplished on your behalf. You don't need to burden yourself with these things anymore. You don't need to be on top. You don't need to win. You don't need to be noticed. You don't need to fight for attention. And then in verses 14 through 21, he describes the impossibly free life. Okay, and these verses are crazy. I mean, I was reading them again last night going, this is ridiculous. Okay, God, this is ridiculous. I mean, it's impossible. I mean, think about this, okay? Bless those who persecute you. He's not talking about, living in some far-off land necessarily and, getting whipped because you say you believe in Jesus. Thankfully, we don't experience that here. Thank God for that. But we do experience lots of other forms of persecution. Emotional persecution, verbal persecution, relational persecution, mental persecution, financial persecution. I mean, we are broken people living in a broken world with other broken people, and that means that persecution is just part of our everyday existence. And we have our own ways of handling that kind of stuff. We protect ourselves, we fight back. He goes on to say in a minute here, don't fight back. You're like, are you kidding me? I mean, my instinct when I'm slapped is to slap back. My instinct when I'm hit is to hit back. In fact, sometimes I'll hit you first just because I think you might hit me, okay? I mean, that's the way we operate, all right? And he says, bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse them. I mean, don't curse them. Don't gossip about them. Don't slander them. Don't look for opportunities to discredit them when you're talking to someone else. Don't get them back. Well, this is crazy, okay? And yet we do know that when we live with vengeance in our own heart, with this driving need to get back, to pay back, it consumes us. Life begins to feel heavy. Life loses its lightness when we're driven by these things. And then he says, love one another with brotherly affection. Okay, that's more doable, I guess. Not really. Outdo one another in showing honor. How many of us do that? I mean, outdo one another in showing honor. I'm so consumed with your success that I spend all of my time praising you, pushing you, encouraging you. I am trying to outdo you before you outdo me in praise and compliment. Okay, I mean, we spend our lives most of the time waiting and wanting people to praise us. And what happens when you don't get it? What happened? Relational frustration, relational tension. Why am I not being noticed? Look at all I do. Look at all I've done. I mean, why in the world I should be noticed? I am a sacrificial person. Look at what I do for you. I mean, every week I have a weekly public deadline where I've got to prepare a sermon, which takes a lot of work, and then preach it. And I serve you well. Don't you? I mean, do something nice. Say something nice, okay? I don't ever think that way, by the way, okay? Ever. But I mean, this is the way we live. This is the way we operate, Husbands and wives have this conversation all the time. Especially if the wife is a mother and kids are smaller and they're just consumed with the amount of work that has to be done, laundry and cooking and cleaning and all of the kinds of stuff that young moms are burdened with having to do in order to take care of their families domestically. And, how many times do guys come home during that stage in life and they've put in an entire day at the office or wherever they work and they are faithfully providing for their families, and what happens? I mean, they walk in the door and the moms are like, good, glad you're here, take the kids, I'm out, with half of her hair ripped out of her head. And the dad is like, now wait a second, woman, okay? I mean, I work hard so that the bills can be paid, so that our family can have a roof over their heads, blah, blah, blah. Kim and I have never had that conversation, by the way, ever. But I mean, it's just a silly snapshot of, what actually happens when we think, okay, I need to be noticed, I need attention. I mean, I need to be recognized for what I'm doing and appreciated for what I've done. Well, that doesn't make life feel lighter. That actually makes life feel heavier, because what if you don't get it? I'm banking on the fact that I'm going to walk in the door after a long, long day, and my family's going to fall at my feet and wash my feet with, perfume and say, "Praise you, O Father, for all that you do to provide for us and the sacrifices you make on our behalf." And when that doesn't happen, and it never has, okay? What do you, if you're living conditionally and transactionally, and you're not operating according to what Paul says here, what happens? Life starts feeling heavy. You get frustrated. I should be noticed. I'm not being noticed. Why? Why aren't I being noticed? And then, live in harmony with one another. That's hard. Do not be haughty. Hard. Associate with the lowly. We're always wanting to associate. We're always trying to associate with those just a little bit further along than we are, because maybe they'll pull us forward. Why in the world would we associate with those behind us? The whole goal is to get ahead. So why would we associate with those behind? Let's try to choose our friendships and our relationships carefully. Let's network well, because you never know when your ship may come in by getting associated with someone who can pull you forward. Okay, that doesn't make life feel lighter. It makes life feel more burdensome. Never be wise in your own sight. Never. In other words, don't assume that everybody wants your opinion, that your opinion is more important than anyone else's. Listen, do not be a perpetual advice giver. Just don't. Give advice when you're asked. Sometimes, if the moment is right, give advice when you're not asked, if it's done within the context of a loving relationship. But don't always be giving advice to people who aren't asking for it. Who wants to be around people like that? Literally, I will not go to sit at a meal with certain people, okay, no one in this church, by the way, because I know what it's going to look like. From the moment I sit down, they're going to be instructing me and advising me and counseling me and giving me their advice about what should be done and not done and what blah, blah, blah. Everything from, gosh, you name it. No one likes you feel like you're being used in that regard. Paul says never be, and that doesn't make life feel lighter for the person receiving advice, because they feel like they're just being burdened and weighed down. Oh my gosh, she's basically pointing out the 10,000 things I need to be doing better. It's also a burden for the one giving advice, because they feel the need to save you, okay, to change you, to rescue you. And if you don't take their advice, you won't be saved. You won't be rescued. And so he says, never be wise in your own sight. Repay no one evil for evil, but give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all. That's crazy. Never repay evil for evil. So as Jesus says, when someone slaps you on one side of the face, turn the other cheek and let them slap you there. Ask them to. Thank you for the one over here. Can you please give me one over here? Okay? This is just repay no one evil for evil. Give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all. If possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. My friend Scotty Smith, who will be here in a few weeks preaching, tweeted something out the other day that was, maybe it was yesterday, it was remarkable and it was helpful to me. And he said, reconciliation is not always achievable here and now. It's just not. But forgiveness is. Okay, so it's not when he says, when he says here, repay no one for evil, no, next verse. If possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. If possible, so far as it depends on you. There are broken relationships where one person is trying to reconcile and the other person just won't for whatever reason. They just won't. Well, at that point, you shouldn't be burdened with, well, if reconciliation doesn't happen, I'm meaningless, failing, whatever the case may be, because it doesn't always depend on you. Reconciliation depends on two people, not just one. And then, this is my favorite one, verse 19. This is the one that I love the most. I've marked it out in black in my Bible, pretending it doesn't exist. Beloved, never avenge yourselves. Never. Not avenge yourself sometimes, don't avenge yourself all the time. There are times when it's appropriate to avenge yourself. And then there are times when it's not. And if you can just figure out the difference between those two things, you'll be fine. That's not what he says. He says, never avenge yourself. Ever. And like I said a few minutes ago, when you are avenging yourself or you're living with the burden of having to pay someone back, doesn't make life lighter, makes life heavier. So you get my point here. What Paul's describing here is a light life, a free life. And then he goes on to say in verse 20, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him something to drink. And then verse 21, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. So he's just describing what lightness feels like. When you're not consumed with yourself, when you're not burdened by the pressure and the need to get, when you're not just obsessed with yourself and, justice, exacting justice, making sure you get ahead, making sure you're noticed, making sure you find yourself on top. Maybe not on top, but at least ahead of him or her. Some people realize, I'll never get to the top, whatever the top is, but I can get ahead of him or her. That's what makes life feel weighty and very, very heavy. So how is it that we can live a life of blessing those who persecute us and never exacting revenge and living in harmony and those sorts of things? I mean, how is it that can become at least a part of our experience in this life? Well, the answer to that clearly is because of everything Paul has told us in the first 11 chapters. We have been overwhelmingly blessed with everything we could ever ask for or imagine. We have been justified. We have been validated because of Christ's work on our behalf. Nothing can separate us from God's love. Our thirst for love, our longing for love has been perfectly satisfied in God's giving of himself to us in the person of Jesus. The acceptance that we long for and look for all around us has been granted to us for free before the throne of God above because of what Jesus has done. I mean, God has provided infinite resources for our longings. And he has spelled that out so clearly in the first 11 chapters of Romans because we need nothing. That's what Paul wants to get across, specifically in chapters 4 through 11. We need nothing, absolutely nothing more than what we already have. Now, life doesn't feel like that. We have a hard time believing that because we think, no, wait a second. We have a hard time, I have a hard time believing that. We have a hard time believing that. No, but there are things we need. But what about, we're fighting. Our internal lawyer is at work trying to build a case for why everything we need, we don't possess, which is why I need you to give to me, and which is why I will spend the rest of my life trying to take from you. Okay, we don't believe it, which is why Martin Luther said that the root of all sin is unbelief. It's just too good to be true. And so this unbelief produces selfish behavior because we don't believe that everything we need in Christ we have. So now I've got to go out and get for myself, which makes life feel heavy. Living to get makes life heavy. For example, because our security is in Jesus' love for us, not whatever love I can extract from you, I don't need to wait to see if you're going to love me before I love you. Now, how many of us do that? I don't, but it's true. I am justified. I am accepted. I am infinitely loved. That's true whether I struggle to believe it or not. It's a fact. It's the objective declaration of the gospel. It's why we need to hear it all the time. Because we are just not constitutionally inclined to believing that. And And so when we just don't believe this idea that because Jesus has done everything for me, I can now do everything for you without needing you to do anything for me. I do need you to do something for me. I need you to pick yourself up. Okay? I mean, I need you to do this. I need you to do that. If you don't, my life is, meaningless, and I'm worthless, and, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. I need this to happen. I need that to happen. That just makes life, gosh, people who live that way they never smile. They just never smile. They're joyless. Their life is heavy. They're depressed. They're despairing because they're not getting what they think they need in order to feel validated. We don't believe it. But the gospel is the good news that absolutely nothing will be able to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus. And once we know that we are forever loved by Jesus, we're free to love others regardless of the risk, because our deep need to love will be satisfied. Our deep need to be loved will be satisfied. And this is why the expression of true freedom is self-forgetfulness, because the gospel, this is what the gospel does. The gospel causes us to look up to Christ and what he did, out to our neighbor and what they need, not into ourselves and how we can make it. Okay, that's the practical, on-the-ground effect of the gospel. The gospel causes us to look up to Christ and what he did vertically, understanding that's true. And then once we understand that that's true, we are now free to look out to our neighbor and what they need, because I don't need anything. If this is true, I need nothing. So now I can spend my life identifying your needs and serving those needs. And it does not cause us to look into ourselves and how we can make it. But listen to me, that in and of itself, it sounds good, and it is good, but we fail to do this all the time, I mean, we're blowing this all the time. I will blow it this afternoon, and so will you, So this is, the good news gets even better than a description of a free life. A description of a free life is super helpful. It's wonderful to hear. It's counterintuitive and beautiful to believe that a life of freedom is a life of self-forgetfulness, not self-indulgence. There's something inside of us that goes, amen. Oh my gosh, that's true. I hope that's true. I want to believe that's true, because I've spent all of my years trying to get, and I'm just flat out exhausted. And I've got bodies of broken relationships in my wake. And I just, it's made my life harder and heavier. And so we hear that and we go, okay, that's good, but I mean, I'm still going to fail at this, I'm still going to blow it. I'm not going to pull this off. And what will that mean for me? What will that do? Well, the good news is even better, because this is what it says. God's love for us does not depend on our love for others. I mean, it even gets better, just more mind-blowing. God's love for us does not depend on our love for others. God's love for us does not even depend on our love for God, which is, thank God. If God's love for me was dependent on my love for him, I'd be in big trouble. Because my love for him at best can be fallen and fallible and cracked. His love for me is infallible, perfect. God does not operate conditionally. He operates unconditionally when it comes to dealing with his adopted sons and daughters. We are never in danger of losing God's love because we've had a bad spiritual day or week or month or year, or because we've made mistakes so grave, so anti what the Bible instructs us to do, so anti what Paul describes here, that God, you know what I prayed this morning? I literally woke up this morning and this is what I prayed. Thank God for thank you for your patience. I bank on your patience. I mean, if I or if you were to experience the full and blunt consequences of what we think, feel, do, fail to think, feel, do, none of us would be here this morning. Okay? I mean, it is the forbearance of the Lord. It is the kindness of the Lord. It is the patience of God because of his unconditional love toward us based on one who stood in our place. That gives us hope. and enables us to wake up every morning with something far better than a clean slate. You know, I mean, we sometimes think about, each new day is great because I wake up with a clean slate. You do not wake up with a clean slate. You went to bed a sinner, a train wreck. You woke up a sinner, a train wreck. Something magical doesn't happen in your sleep where it's all wiped clean, okay? I mean, you were screwed up when you went to bed, you're screwed up when you wake up, okay? Nothing happens in the, 6, 8, 12 hours that you sleep at night, okay? So you wake up every morning, Christian, with something far better than a clean slate. You wake up basked in the unconditional love of God despite your unclean slate. Okay, so God's love for you is based on what Jesus has done, and that means it's not based on your love for others or your love for God. In fact, our love for God and our love for others depends on God's perfect love for us. 1 John 4:19, we love him because he first loved us. So the gospel of grace is the announcement that all of this incomprehensible good news really is true. You are forever loved. You are forever vindicated. You are forever forgiven. Slavish scorekeeping is over. It's over. Sweatshop is closed. The treadmill has been unplugged. It's no good. Your conditional currency is no good with God. And in God's economy, the unconditionality of his amazing grace and love for us that grips us, sets us free by resting secure in the knowledge that nothing can separate us from God's love, and therefore I am now free to spend my life giving without feeling the burden of having to get from you. And that's what we celebrate when we come to the Lord's table. When we come to the Lord's table, when we celebrate communion together as God's family, God is once again reminding us that we can't pull it off, that everything we need in Christ we already possess, that God has done everything for us because we could not do it ourselves, that he's given everything to us because we could not get it for ourselves. It's a reminder that Jesus paid it all. It is Jesus' sweet reminder through his broken body and shed blood that it is finished. And that we can now rest and rejoice and even work to serve the needs of other people because we don't need anything any longer. It's been done for us.